Welcome back for part 2 of this series dedicated to Dawn of Madness, the narrative horror board game by Diemension Games. In the last video we introduced quite a few components and some terminology, and now we're finally ready to dive into some gameplay. The Wanderer stage may last up to 10 rounds, and each round consists of 3 phases. First is the event phase, which includes reading the storybook entry shown on the round tracker. Next is the action phase, which forms the bulk of each round. Both Wanderers and monsters will take turns spending their mental capacity to perform actions, until eventually everyone has reached the bottom of the mental capacity track. And finally, there's the refresh phase, which involves a little housekeeping in preparation for the next round. We'll kick off round 1 with the event phase, but I'm not going to read entry 10 from the storybook because spoilers. So instead you'll have to settle for an extremely unexciting block of pixelated text. At the bottom there are some gameplay instructions in bold telling us to spawn the aftershock terror at a random location. So I'll roll a die and place the terror at location 11, the storage room. Let's take a closer look at the terror card. First we need to populate it with 3 domain rift tokens. You can see a faint outline of where those tokens should be placed. We'll roll 3 sentience dice matching the world shard card it spawned on. In this case a purple and 2 yellows. Then we'll place the domains we rolled on the terror card in the form of domain rift tokens. These represent both its strengths and its vulnerabilities, which we can use to attack it. Beneath the rift tokens we have its health, mental capacity, and the reward we get if we manage to defeat it, in this case 1 measly existence token. At the bottom is a passive ability, which remains in effect as long as the monster is on the board. Passive abilities cover a variety of situations, and they can be easy to overlook, so it's a good idea to make a mental note of everyone's passive abilities near the start of each round. Down the right side of the card we have a list of actions, each with a mental capacity cost. Fortunately, monsters only perform one of these actions on their turn, not all of them. We'll take a closer look at these when the terror has its turn. Aftershock has a mental capacity of 4, so let's put that token on the mental capacity track. In a real game you'd probably spawn more than 1 terror, but let's keep this simple. Another important step to remember in the event phase, and one which is easy to overlook, is to check the deck of encounter cards which have spawning conditions printed on the back. If any of those conditions are met, place the card face up on the indicated world shard. To avoid spoilers, we'll only check the top card, which says, if the Wanderers have the Coda card Electroshock Therapy, spawn this encounter in the treatment centre. Note that you only check these conditions during the event phase, so they won't spawn partway through a round. And that's it for the event phase. Now it's on to the action phase. The first turn goes to the Abomination, because it's at the top of the mental capacity track. As you can see, the Abomination's card is quite similar to the terror we just looked at, with its own health, mental capacity, and a sequence of actions running down the right side. Unique to Abominations, we also have a box in the top left corner related to the Devour rules, which I'm not using in this game. Even when you're not using the Devour rules, it's helpful to at least recognise the Devour icon so that you can ignore it. In the bottom left is an effect which kicks in whenever a Wanderer dies. Each Abomination has its own effect, and it's in addition to the other rules for Wanderer death, which we'll look at later. Monster actions are listed in order of priority, so when a monster activates, start at the top and look for the first action which it's able to perform. For example, the monster might not be able to perform the topmost action due to not having enough mental capacity, or not being near a Wanderer. In this case, the top action tells us to resolve the active Confrontation card if possible. On the Confrontation card, we're only interested in the action described on the bottom half of the card. It costs 4 mental capacity, which it can definitely afford, but the action is only applicable to a Wanderer in the same space as the Abomination. Since there aren't any, we can't perform that action, so instead we return to the Abomination's card and try the next action in the list. The requirement is shown at the top, no Wanderer in its space. That's true, so the effect is Adorable moves up to 2 + X spaces towards the Wanderer with the most envenomed cards, where X equals the Wanderer's total envenomed cards. Envenomed is a condition card. Fortunately, neither of the Wanderers have any of those, so far. So, as a tiebreaker, Adorable will target the nearest Wanderer, in this case Emily, That's actually a general rule of the game, and well worth memorising. There are lots of different criteria which monsters use to choose their target, but if 2 or more targets are equally valid, the monster will always choose the nearest. And if Emily and Lynas had both been the same distance away, then it would have been up to players to decide which one to target. So the Abomination moves 2 spaces towards Emily, and unfortunately it reaches her. Damn it. That action cost 2 mental capacity, so I'll move it down the track. Normally that would be the end of the monster's turn, but in this case the action says, if it ends in a Wanderer space, immediately check the action below. The action's requirement is, a Wanderer is in its space. That's true, so we must resolve the active Confrontation card if possible. So it's back to the Confrontation card again, and this time the action can be applied. It says Adorable deals 3+X blue damage to Emily, where X is the number of her envenomed cards. So that's 3 blue damage altogether. Okay, that's not terrific news for Emily, but it's a great learning opportunity for us, because it's an example of damage of a particular sentience colour. Not all damage specifies a colour, but when it does, your Wanderer can attempt to defend against it. This is called a defence test, which is a specific type of sentience test. Before we perform this test, I'll just point out that the game won't remind you to perform defence tests, so don't forget about them. If you're new to the game and you forget them entirely, then you're likely to get about as erect as a snowflake in a furnace. In this case, the incoming damage is blue, so we'll need to roll blue dice, and as always, the Wanderer's sentience attributes determine the number of dice they can roll. Emily has a blue sentience of 2, so I'll roll that many blue sentience dice. Because this is a defence test, I'm trying to roll the eye symbol, which sometimes represents awareness and also evasion. Okay, I didn't manage to roll an eye symbol, but remember that the sphere symbol can be used as a wildcard, so I'll treat that as if it were an eye. That reduces the incoming blue damage by 1, which is great. In addition, it's a general rule of the game that whenever a Wanderer performs a sentience test, you can take domains from their dashboard and add them to the results you rolled. In this case I need blue eye domains, so I'll check Emily's dashboard. She does have a blue eye domain, so I think I'll add that to my dice result. She also has a blue sphere domain on her dashboard, so I can treat that as a blue eye, just like I did on the sentience die. This technique of using domains from your dashboard to supplement your dice results is fundamental to the game, because you can do it for any and all sentience tests. Personally, I like to move the coloured sentience markers off the dashboard and place them with the dice I rolled, but do be careful not to lose track of which domain each marker represents. So that's the end of Emily's defence test, and she managed to reduce the damage to 0. Naturally, the spent domains go back to the supply along with the sentience dice. That's also the end of the Abomination's action, and the mental capacity cost of 4 is shown on the Confrontation card. So they move down the track and hopefully won't be bothering us for a while. And since we did perform the action shown on the Confrontation card, we replace it with a new one. And finally, it's the Wanderer's turn to act. Whenever you have multiple characters on the same space of the mental capacity track, then you can choose the order in which they activate, provided all the monsters go first. In this case it's just between Emily and Lynas, and I think we'll start with Lynas. On their turn, a Wanderer may perform any one of the following actions. As you'd expect, most of these actions have an associated cost in mental capacity. You'll find a helpful list of these actions, including a description of each, in the quick reference on the back cover of the rulebook. Most of this video will consist of Emily and Lynas gradually trying out all of these actions so that we can see how they work. As you might guess, there's a balance to be struck between fighting monsters and exploring the other world, and since Lynas is feeling pretty safe in his current location, he's going to start by exploring the world shard he's on, the living room. This is called an encounter action, and it costs 2 mental capacity. This lets him resolve the story entry at the bottom of the living room card. For obvious reasons, I'm not going to share any of the actual story entry, but for the sake of argument, suppose he sat down on the sofa and the sofa tried to swallow him. The storybook might say something like, test green for 2 eye. This is another example of a sentience test, called an encounter test. Linus's green sentience attribute is 2, so he gets to roll 2 green dice. In this case he'll need a result with at least 2 green eye domains to pass the test. I'll roll the dice, and sadly neither of those results are eyes, or sphere symbols, which are wild. I'll check his dashboard for green eye domains, and unfortunately he has none. Nor does he have any green sphere domains which could stand in for green eyes. So that's a total of 0 green eyes, well short of the 2 he needed. I should mention that there are some other techniques for mitigating dice rolls, but I'm deliberately postponing those until much later in the video because I think it's best to start by getting a good handle on the basics. Having failed the test, the storybook entry describes his unsuccessful battle with the sofa, and he's told to take 2 points of damage. Unfortunately, the damage doesn't specify a colour, so we can't reduce it with a defence test like Emily did. He's also forced to take an overwrought condition card. That says your existence card's cost is increased by 1. There are 11 types of condition cards in the game, most of which are negative, and the effect of each condition is printed on the card. Note that you can acquire more than one copy of the same condition card, and their effects are cumulative. So if Lynas gets another overwrought card, then his existence cards will cost even more. There's even more story after that, and eventually he's told to apply this list of effects. There's really no limit on the sort of things the storybook will ask you to do, and this is just a small example. First he gains 2 existence tokens. Then we place a completed token on the encounter so that it can't be taken again. We advance story point tracker B by 2 points. And finally we're told to retrieve a particular card from the encounter deck and place it on the living room world shard. That new encounter is available to any wanderer who visits this location, and as you can imagine, it will let players dig deeper into that part of the story. That's the end of Lynas's encounter action, which cost him 2 mental capacity, so down he goes. Encounters like that one make up an important part of the game, but because they're so narrative and spoilery, I won't be doing any more in this video. But there are a couple of other features which I'll mention. Firstly, some encounters may have an entry condition printed on the card, whereas if there's no entry condition, then any wanderer can resolve it. It's also helpful to know that some encounters are written from the central wanderer's perspective, while others are written from a more generic perspective. These are labelled Reality Shard and Exploration, respectively, in the storybook. These labels can help you make sense of the story's point of view, but they don't limit which wanderer can resolve the encounter. In our game, for example, Lynas can and will resolve some encounters which describe Emily's point of view, and he'll experience things as if entering her mind. It's part of the disorienting nature of the other world. And that's it for encounters. Let's move on to Emily's turn. Since the Abomination is right in front of her, Emily decides to try and inflict some damage. Attacking an Abomination is somewhat different from attacking other monsters, which is why there are 2 separate actions, depending on your target. The Confrontation Action is specifically for wounding the Abomination, whereas the Attack Action is for other monsters. Before we look at the differences between these 2 actions, let's look at the similarities. Both of these actions have the same cost, namely 2 mental capacity, plus more if you're attacking from a distance. You can attack from up to 3 spaces away by spending 1 extra mental capacity per space. In our game, Emily and the Abomination are in the same space, so this confrontation will only cost her 2 mental capacity. But if they were, say, 2 spaces apart, like this, then it would cost her 4 mental capacity. As I say, these costs are the same for all monsters. Now let's look at the Confrontation Action, which is specific to the Abomination. Emily needs to perform a confrontation test, which involves rolling sentience dice and trying to match the domains shown on the active confrontation card. In this case, she needs 2 green eye domains and 2 blue brain domains. For confrontation tests in general, you can include sentience dice of any colour, but for this test I'm only going to roll green and blue dice because dice of other colours simply aren't going to help. Okay, let's see what we get. Wow, the only way that roll could have been any worse is if the dice had knocked over a candle, set fire to the curtains and burned the house down. Okay, that's a slight exaggeration. The blue sphere can stand in for a blue brain, so I'll put that on the card. That's 1 down, 3 to go. Next I'll check Emily's dashboard for green eye domains or blue brain domains. And she has none. A sphere domain would help if it were blue or green, but she doesn't have those either. Well, I did warn you that the Abomination was no pushover. At this point I'm going to just give up and say that we failed the confrontation test. Later in this video we'll learn about domain cards, Coda cards and special effects, all of which can hopefully make your own confrontations more successful than this one. If the confrontation test had succeeded, then we'd get to apply the damage shown on the bottom right corner of the confrontation card, and also gain the reward shown at the top. Then we'd replace the confrontation card with a new one. But in our game we failed, so let's just chalk it up to experience and carry on. Failing a confrontation test has no effect, so we'll end Emily's turn by spending 2 mental capacity, which was the cost of her action. And because we didn't inflict any damage, we don't draw a new confrontation card. Emily and Lynas are highest on the mental capacity track, so either one can go next. Emily's feeling a bit vulnerable, standing right next to the Abomination, so she decides to move away. The move action allows you to move up to 3 spaces by spending 1 mental capacity per space. So movement is kind of expensive, but at least it's easy to remember. I think I'll move her just 1 space to here, at a cost of 1 mental capacity. And now it's Linus's turn. Up until now I've been deliberately ignoring these support cards here at the bottom of the board, but now that we've got a handle on the basic gameplay loop, let's see how support cards fit in. As mentioned in the previous video, these cards help to balance the game when playing with fewer than 4 Wanderers. With only 2 Wanderers in our game, we get 5 support cards. A moment ago we saw how, on their turn, Wanderers get to choose from this list of actions, most of which have a cost in mental capacity. In a nutshell, support cards let you perform some of these actions without having to pay the mental capacity cost. For example, this card lets you perform either a move action of up to 3 spaces or a search action on your turn. Both of those actions are described on the quick reference, and they work the same way whether you pay for them with mental capacity or a support card. Each support card can only be used once per round, so after performing the action, remember to flip the card face down. At the very end of the round, when we're setting up for the following round, we'll flip all the support cards face up again. Note that using a support card will cover the entire cost of your action. For example, a move action can cost up to 3 mental capacity, but this support card will reduce the cost to 0. Support cards are pretty straightforward, but there's one important rule which you'll need to keep in mind. You can never use 2 support cards in a row. You must perform at least one other action in between each support card. Lynas decides to use this support card to perform a search action. This action is pretty simple, as it lets you draw a random card from the top of the domain deck. Lynas draws a butcher's knife, which I'll add to his hand. And of course I'll need to turn the support card face down. Thanks to that support card, Lynas didn't need to spend the 1 mental capacity that a search action normally costs. Another important rule is that some Wanderer actions can only be performed once per round, and the search action is one of those. So you can't just spam the search action at the very start of the game. But fortunately, support cards don't count against that limit. So Lynas can perform another search action later this round if he chooses to. We'll come back to once per round actions later in this video. And since he's just acquired this rather gruesome looking kitchen utensil, I think that this would be a good time to take a closer look at domain cards. In the previous video, we saw how domain cards often represent items and equipment, and there will be some text on the card describing when and where the item can be used. Sometimes items specify a number of charges at the top, in which case you place that number of charges on the card as soon as you acquire it. You can use existence tokens to represent charges, but be careful not to get them mixed up with the existence tokens your Wanderer has collected. Usually those domain cards will tell you to discard 1 charge each time you use the item. But there's also a completely different way you can use a domain card. At the very bottom of every domain card is a row of domains. If you're performing a sentience test, you can add these domains to the result you rolled to help you pass the test, but only if you're prepared to sacrifice the card. Discarding a really useful or beloved item can feel like a high price to pay just to help you pass a test, but remember that each Wanderer can carry a maximum of 4 domain cards, so you'll probably have to let some of them go eventually. Of course, the domains at the bottom explain why they're called domain cards and not item cards, because you can sacrifice them to add domains to your dice results. This technique works for all sentience tests, including the ones we saw earlier in this video. Lynas can try out his butcher's knife soon, but for now, let's carry on with the game. Lynas is still highest on the mental capacity track, so it's his turn again, but as mentioned, he's not allowed to use another support card until after he's performed some other action. He's managed to gather a couple of existence tokens, so this is a good time to look at the existence action. As you may recall from the previous video, Lynas is a priest, and he has his own deck of existence cards, each containing a skill or proficiency related to his background. You can look through this deck at any time to see which cards you might want to purchase. The cost is shown at the bottom in existence tokens, and the existence action lets you purchase one of these cards. The good news is that this action doesn't cost any mental capacity. After all, you're already having to pay for the card with your hard-earned existence tokens. But it's important to remember that, just like the other Wanderer actions, you can only perform this action on your turn. In other words, you can go window shopping at any time, but you can't buy anything unless you're highest on the mental capacity track. Unfortunately, Lynas still has the overwrought condition, so he has to spend one extra token to purchase an existence card. I don't want to spoil any of Lynas's existence cards, so let's just say he spends his 2 tokens and gains a new ability, which normally has a cost of 1. Unlike domain cards, there's no limit to the number of existence cards he can have at the same time. That's the end of his existence action, and he's still at the top of the mental capacity track, so he decides to perform an attack action. This lets your Wanderer attack a terror or a malformation from up to 3 spaces away. Of course, there are no malformations on the board, so he's going to attack Aftershock, which is a terror. As mentioned earlier, attacking any monster has a base cost of 2 mental capacity, plus more to attack from a distance. In this case, Aftershock is 2 spaces away from Lynas, so the action will cost him a whopping 4 mental capacity. Let's hope he can make it count. Like all terrors and malformations, Aftershock has rift tokens on its card, which we place there as soon as it spawned. These tokens represent weaknesses or vulnerabilities we can exploit for our attack. First, we need to declare which of the rift tokens we're going to attack, and then we perform an attack test trying to roll domains which match the rift token. As with all sentience tests, the number of dice you get to roll depends on your sentience attributes. At the moment, all Lynas's attributes are at 2, so I'll be rolling 2 dice no matter which rift I choose to attack. I think I'll attack the purple brain rift. Because this is an attack test, we'll inflict 1 damage for every purple brain we roll. Okay, damn it, that's no use at all. We wanted purple brains, or even purple spheres, which we could treat as brains. So that's 0 damage so far. Unfortunately, Lynas doesn't have any purple brains on his dashboard, but he does have 1 purple sphere, so I can add that to the result and treat it as if it were a brain. It's also worth checking his domain cards to see if they have any purple brains or purple spheres, but there are none. Though to be honest, even if there had been, I don't think I'm ready to discard either of his domain cards. So unfortunately, Lynas has only managed to inflict 1 point of damage on Aftershock. But we're not done yet. His butcher knife has this effect. Weapon. When dealing at least 1 damage during your attack action, you may spend X hand domains to deal X additional damage, where X is no more than 3. Which is great because Lynas has 2 hand domains on his dashboard. The card doesn't mention colour, so any colour should do. I'm going to spend both of those, returning them to the supply, and inflict another 2 points of damage. Now that's more like it. Now the terror is down to half his original health. If we manage to kill it, we'll get 1 existence token, as shown here, but for now we don't get any reward. Notice that the butcher knife said, you may spend hand domains, which is why they had to come from Lynas's dashboard. We couldn't use the hand domain we rolled because dice results cannot be spent. Also note that the butcher knife effect says during your attack action, which means that it can't be used against an abomination. It's only terrors and malformations which can be targeted with an attack action. The abomination can only be damaged with a confrontation action. It's time to wrap up this attack action, and it's important to remember that if you inflicted any damage, you must remove the rift token you attacked. We did inflict damage, so I'll remove the purple brain token, and now it's down to just 2 rift tokens. Which is not great for us, because now it has fewer vulnerabilities for us to attack. If a monster ever has its last rift token removed, then we immediately add 3 new ones, just like we did when it first spawned. That's the end of Lynas's turn, so we move him down the mental capacity track. The attack action cost 4, so now he's nearly at the bottom. Okay, Emily, Adorable and Aftershock are tied on the track, and unfortunately monsters always get to act first. I'll start with Aftershock. As with all monsters, we check its list of actions and apply the topmost one which can be performed. The top action has a requirement of no Wanderer in its space, which is true. The cost of this action will be 2 mental capacity, which it can afford. The effect reads, Aftershock moves up to X spaces towards the Wanderer with the most hand domains. Okay, Lynas just spent all his hand domains, so he has none, whereas Emily has 1, so now Aftershock is coming after her. The action tells us that Aftershock will move X spaces, where X equals that Wanderer's total hand domains. In other words, just 1 space, which is great because he won't be able to reach her. In fact, he's 3 spaces away from Emily, and we get to choose between 2 alternative paths. I think I'll choose this path and move him 1 space along it. The action also says if Aftershock ends in a Wanderer's space, immediately check the action below. There's no one else in his space, so that's the end of Aftershock's turn, and his action costs 2 mental capacity. Before we move on, I'll just point out a feature of Aftershock's card, even though it hasn't come into play. If we look at Aftershock's second action box, you'll notice that it actually has 2 effects, separated by a horizontal line. The first effect, printed in white, is the primary ability. It says, when a Wanderer is in its space, Aftershock deals 2 red damage to the Wanderer with the most hand domains in its space. Beneath that is the secondary ability, or Domain Rift ability, printed in gold. It's called that because it depends on the Domain Rift tokens which are currently on the card. This one says, deals 1 additional red damage for each hand domain rift on this card. Currently there are no hand domain rifts on the card, so the secondary ability would be ignored. Notice that we don't treat this yellow sphere rift as if it were a hand, or any other domain type. You only do that with test results and with domains on your dashboard. You'll discover that secondary abilities are quite common on both terrors and malformations. Here's one more example taken from the rulebook. I won't go into detail, but notice that the ability begins with a skull icon, a colon, and then some gold text describing the effect. This means that the effect should only be applied if there's at least 1 skull token on the monster's card. And with that covered, let's return to our game. It's now the Abomination's turn, and this is going to play out a lot like its earlier turn. To avoid spoiling any more confrontation cards, and to reduce repetition, I'll play that off screen. The basket of kittens chases after Emily, but fortunately it doesn't have enough mental capacity to attack her. So the turn ends, and it spends 2 mental capacity. And finally, Emily gets to take her turn. I should point out that in a real game I'd be making more use of these support cards, and probably using the encounter action to explore the environment and progress the story tracks. But this is just a how to play video, so I'm not going to repeat stuff I've already shown. Instead, I'll introduce a new Wanderer action called a Domain Action. This action is both simple and also a welcome oasis amidst the horrors of the otherworld, because it lets you replenish the domains on your Wanderer's dashboard. You get to roll 3 sentience dice, matching the colours shown on your World Shard card. And whatever you roll, you add to your dashboard. Note that this isn't a test, so you can't treat the sphere symbol as a wildcard. If you roll a sphere, then you add a sphere domain to your dashboard. And the action costs just 1 mental capacity. There's one very important limitation on this action, which is that each Wanderer can only perform it once per round. As mentioned, this once per round limitation applies to 3 different Wanderer actions. The Domain action, which Emily just used to place new domains on her dashboard, the Search action, which Lynas used earlier to draw a new domain card, and finally the Trade action, which allows Wanderers in the same space to trade domain cards. The Trade action has a cost of 0 mental capacity, by the way. If you're playing with fewer than 4 Wanderers, then you'll be using support cards, and it's important to remember that support card actions never count against these once per round limits. Now, if you're playing this game solo, and like me you have the memory of a goldfish, then it might not be trivial to keep track of these limits for each Wanderer. For this video, I'll create these little action tokens for each Wanderer and flip them face down when they've performed that action, without using a support card. So Emily has just used her Domain action, and Lynas hasn't used any of his. He did perform a Search action earlier in this round, but that was using a support card. We're getting quite near the end of the round, and the good news is that we've now met all the basic Wanderer actions. The final one, Component Actions, just refers to other actions you may uncover as you play the game. They're printed on game components such as cards or in the Central Wanderer's storybook. Now that everyone is near the bottom of the mental capacity track, I'll point out an important rule regarding mental capacity. If a monster is running low on mental capacity and it doesn't have enough to pay for any of its available actions on its turn, then it immediately drops to 0 mental capacity. Similarly, if a wanderer can't or doesn't want to perform an action on their turn, then they also drop to 0. This guarantees that everyone will eventually reach 0 and the round ends. Before going any further, I need to introduce some new rules regarding the little plastic sentience cubes which wanderers like to hoard on their dashboard. We've already seen how useful those are, because anytime a wanderer performs a sentience test, they can supplement their dice results with domains from their dashboard. We've seen that happening throughout this video, and hopefully it's just second nature by now. But there's actually a second way these cubes can be used, as if they weren't valuable enough already. You can spend them on various helpful effects, called special effects. There are quite a few different special effects, depending on the symbol and colour of the domain you spend. I'm going to go through them all now, but I'll point out that if you're new to the game, you absolutely do not need to memorise any of these. They're all listed in the quick reference guide, and you'll gradually get familiar with them the more you play the game. The first special effect lets you spend hand domains to re-roll dice of the same colour. For example, let's suppose Emily was performing a sentience test. She just rolled 2 green dice, and she didn't like the result. She could spend this green hand domain on her dashboard for its special effect. That would let her re-roll 1 green die. Skull domains let you assist other wanderers when they're performing a test. Each skull domain you spend lets the other wanderer add an extra die of matching colour to their roll. Continuing our previous example, let's suppose that Emily still wasn't happy with the green dice she rolled. Lynas could assist her by spending a green skull domain from his dashboard for its special effect. This would enable Emily to roll another green die and add it to the others, hopefully improving the result. This can be done no matter how far apart the wanderers are. Brain domains can be used to reduce the cost of various wanderer actions. Each brain domain you spend reduces the mental capacity cost of your action by 1, and the colour of the brain domain determines which action it can subsidise. For example, green brain domains can be used to pay for the move action. If Lynas were moving 3 spaces, he might pay for it with 1 green brain domain and 2 mental capacity. Similarly, red brains can reduce the cost of attack actions or confrontations. Purple brains are the most versatile, as they can subsidise any action. Eye domains don't really have a special effect other than being useful during defence tests. We saw Emily perform a defence test when she was attacked by the basket of kittens, so I won't go over that again. As we've already seen, sphere domains can stand in for other domain types when you're performing a sentience test, which is a pretty excellent superpower already. But be aware that they can also stand in for other domain types when you're using special effects. For example, if you had a sphere domain on your dashboard, you might treat it as if it were a hand and use it to re-roll a die. Or you might pretend that it's a skull and use it to assist another wanderer. So yeah, have fun trying to spot all the different ways you can spend your sphere domains. And that's all of the special effects. Personally, I absolutely love them because they add a richness and depth to the gameplay, and it feels fantastic when you use just the right effect at the right time. But I deliberately waited until near the end of this video to introduce them because I didn't want to risk muddying the waters. In fact, if you're about to teach the game to someone who's easily intimidated by a large number of rules, then you might even consider leaving out the special effects from your first game. Now let's get back to our game to learn just a few more rules before we wrap up this video. It's Emily's turn, and she decides to perform an encounter action using the encounter printed on her World Shard card. This normally costs 2 mental capacity, but we can reduce that cost by 1 by spending this yellow brain domain on her dashboard for its special effect. And I'll pay the remaining mental capacity at the end of her action. As usual, I won't spoil the storybook entry, but let's say that it ends with this list of game effects. She gains an existence token and loses 1 mental capacity. Note that if your mental capacity is already at 0 and the game tells you to reduce it further, then you suffer damage instead. Similarly, if the game tells you to lose existence tokens and you don't have any, then you suffer damage instead, on a one-to-one basis. Fortunately, these rules are included in the quick reference. She's also told to place a red consequence token on her current space. The effect of that token will depend on the game. The next instruction tells her to lose 2 points of health. However, Emily chooses to discard her existence token to reduce the damage to 1. In other words, anytime you're about to lose health points, you can discard existence tokens instead on a one-to-one basis. Be warned that if you use this option too often, you might struggle to pay for existence cards, which contain useful skills and abilities. And finally, the encounter gives her a particular Coda card. On the front of that card, we can see that it modifies her green and red sentience attributes, so we'll update that on her sentience pad. Coda cards also have a row of sentience colours on the back, and it's about time we learned how those work. Next time Emily is performing a confrontation action to fight the basket of kittens, she'll have the option of using one, and only one, of her Coda cards to roll some additional dice and to add them to her result. In our earlier example, Emily was trying to roll green eyes and blue brains for the confrontation test, and she wasn't having much luck. If only she'd had this card, she could have rolled an additional 2 green dice and 1 blue die and added them to the result. The purple and yellow on this card wouldn't have been of any use. But there's no such thing as a free lunch, and if you use a Coda card this way, you must place an exhausted token on it. Once a Coda card has an exhausted token, you can't use it during future confrontations unless you find a way to remove that token. Note that the exhausted token only applies to the row of colours shown on the back of the card. It has no effect on these sentience attribute modifiers on the front of the card. Those attribute modifiers still apply as long as you possess the card. That's the end of the encounter action, and Emily pays the discounted price of 1 mental capacity. To keep this video from dragging, I'm actually going to finish this round off screen. I'll just fast forward to the point where everyone has reached the bottom of their mental capacity track. As you may recall from near the start of this video, a single round is divided into 3 phases, and we've now finished the action phase. So it's time for the refresh phase, which is just a quick upkeep phase. There's a list of steps in the quick reference, but the only ones which apply to our current game are restoring everyone's mental capacity, flipping all the support cards face up, and just for this video, the once per round tokens. And finally, flipping the current round tracker face down. And that's the end of round 1, the end of this gameplay session, and the end of this video. We've covered more than enough rules to get you up and running for your life in the other world. But I'm also working on another video, the third and final in the series. That video will be much shorter and cover just a few additional topics such as Wanderer Death, the finale stage, lineage envelopes, and the optional Devour components. See you there!